Hey everybody, this is the Chicago scene. We're back on the virtual satellite dish here, but for good reason. It's Halloween time, and I have a monster expert to join me. I'm here with Dr. Emily Zarka, host of Monstrum on PBS. How are you, Emily? How are you?
Thank you for having me back on. I'm doing fantastic. It's official spooky season, so I'm just excited for Halloween.
Right, me too. I feel like I can only speak for myself, really, and my family, but I almost love Halloween than I love any other holiday. So,
Same.
hence my Halloween shirt that I have here with all the Universal monsters and stuff
I
like
love
that.
it. I have a little vampire necklace going on here, so we're both thematically
Ah,
appropriate.
perfect. I love it. So obviously Halloween falls on a Sunday this year. Everybody's really excited, or everybody that loves Halloween is, I should say, including me. So I want to nerd out a little bit with you and talk about some monster folklore and whether or not monsters are real, are they not real, where do they come from? But we're going to talk about werewolves, Halloween lore, like where Halloween maybe came from, or
Mhm.
specific monsters like Dracula and all that good stuff. And then the Mothman, just because I think it's a really cool thing
Yeah.
to talk about. And there's a movie been made about all of
Mhm.
these things, but the Mothman Prophecies is one of the movies that like changed my world growing
Oh,
up because
really?
it was kind of terrifying and awesome all in one because for what it's about. So why don't we get into Halloween lore in general, and what can you tell us about Halloween lore?
So the most important thing to think about Halloween when we conceptualize the holiday today is that historians basically trace a lot of the traditions to the ancient Celtic celebration of Samhain, which essentially was their religious new year. Samhain was the time that marked the end of the growing and the harvesting season, and it was celebrated on November 1st, but festivities started the night before on
Huh.
October 31st around that time. So they believed that during this period, the veil between the living and the dead, between our world and what they refer to as the other world, was thinned. So this was the time when the fae folk could come out, when malevolent spirits could come out, but also when ghosts who died from the past year could transfer over. So it was a time of bonfires, of celebration, but also a time when costumes would be worn and other rituals take place to sort of make sure that those more malevolent spirits wouldn't be able to get you. So things like costuming, leaving food out, even the idea of a jack-o'-lantern can be traced back to that holiday, but also to the Christian holiday of All Souls Day, which essentially was when the Catholic Church decided that we're going to sort of adopt this pagan holiday and add a little veil of Christianity and religion to it. So that became part of the tradition as well, because one of the most important things about All Souls Day was that the poorer parishioners of a town or a village would walk to the houses and ask for money or food in exchange for prayer, which again contributes to our trick-or-treating tradition.
Unbelievable. I feel like a lot of this monster lore kind of dates back to some sort of religious belief or
Mhm.
religion saying a certain thing or a certain way, which definitely has some impact with like where werewolves came from and all that stuff. And we'll get to that in a second. But any fun things you can talk about in terms of like the traditional
Mhm.
Halloween? I mean, we all know Frankenstein was actually not the name of the monster, but the name of the
No.
man that created the monster. But anything of those like old school classics that you can shed some light on, including like Dracula and all that good
Yeah,
stuff.
of course. Again, I think that what's really important to think about when we're talking about monsters is that so many monsters can trace their history back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So while Mary Shelley's Frankenstein definitely introduced this creature that's become so famous today, there's an older tradition of sort of undead bodies and
Ah,
reanimated bodies in history, vampires and the undead being one of them. But I think what's important about Frankenstein and Dracula is that so much of our modern conception of vampires and Frankenstein's creature come from those early movies. And I think that the film industry really did change how we perceive monsters. Again, even if they were around for hundreds or thousands of years before, there's
hmm.
something about seeing those images on screen. And of course, the actors who played them have become icons and legends in their own right. But yes, Frankenstein's creature is not the monster in Mary Shelley's original text. So it's really interesting to see how people have adapted her ideas throughout history.
Yeah, it's amazing what we all, for some reason, I myself growing up especially, but just I think my friends in general, you kind of always just believed what the movies told you because you're growing up as a kid, so you thought Frankenstein started there, where obviously it's from years before, but Dracula especially is from hundreds of years before, if not more, right?
So Bram Stoker he took a lot of research and folklore information that he collected. We know that he wrote at least 124 pages of notes in preparation for writing Dracula. So he was clearly doing his research, and he actually read books about werewolves and about witch trials and really integrated himself in European folklore. So he was exposed to some of these ideas of the undead from places like Romania, from Greece, from Eastern Europe. And he sort of consolidated all that information and took some inspiration from earlier Gothic vampire texts and created this count, this icon of Dracula. And in the original outlining of the story, Dracula was just called the Count. So it's a common misconception that he heard the name Dracula first and then developed the story. It was actually kind of the reverse.
All right, so that is Count Dracula and some of the lore that comes from there. But I feel like one of the most popular ones, I mean, certainly I've watched many werewolf movie, including American Werewolf in London, what I just watched is one of my favorite werewolf movies. And of course, Thriller. I mean, werewolf lore is just, maybe hasn't been as popular as vampire lore lately, just because of all the movies that were made about vampires, but werewolves have been dated back hundreds and hundreds of years, and almost to I know that reading some of your research or watching some of it, it was from religious beliefs mixed in with other beliefs. So why don't you just give me a little rundown? I know that there's 3 categories of werewolves, right? There's the victim, the damned, and the warrior, right?
Yes. So to answer your question, werewolves actually go back thousands and thousands of years. The first recorded werewolf story that we have is actually from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is thousands of years back in BCE time. So the undead and werewolves, or wolf to human shapeshifters or human to wolf shapeshifters, are some of our earliest legends from my research that I found. So werewolves, what's really interesting about them is that wolves were once the most dominant land-based predator throughout the globe. So it would make sense that we'd see a lot of these human to wolf transformations simply because they're exposed to this predator on a day-to-day basis, which is really interesting. So we have these different subsets of the werewolf that emerge in ancient culture. So yes, there's the sort of true kind, which is someone who's cursed or damned for an evil deed. There's the false kind, which is just a victim who falls prey to, some god or some unfortunate meaning. And then there's the warrior type, which are humans who purposely try to take on lupine characteristics to be more efficient in battle. And all of those threads sort of overlap in a way, but we can trace little bits of them to certain places. So for example, the berserker tradition in the ancient Nordic peoples falls under the warrior type, whereas we see a lot of the damned or true werewolf in ancient Greek and Roman legends.
And some of those beliefs from those acts of war that they did, where they're in battle and they're screaming and some of them howling, that all adds to this lore and myth of the werewolf, where some even further along in history where science became part of the conversation, where they would want to discuss scientifically some of the accounts from happening in the past. There are some scientific accounts, like I forgot the one, but there was rabies was one, but there was another disease that people could ingest, or they can ingest something to cause something.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So one of the most common explanations we see for both werewolves and witchcraft, and again, there's a lot of overlap there. We see a rise in werewolf accusations in Europe whenever there's a rise in witch hunts. So there's definitely a correlation going on there. But people want to believe it's part of something called ergot poisoning, which is a fungus that commonly grows on a lot of the staple grains. Well, excuse me, it doesn't commonly grow, but it's a fungus that can grow on a lot of the staple crops. And hypothetically, if people were to ingest that fungus, it does cause things like hallucinations, uncontrollable body movements. But to be honest, there is not a whole lot of historical evidence that proves that ergot poisoning is the explanation for all of these werewolves. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Ergot poisoned food and grain looks diseased. I mean, it'd be very implausible to me, at least, that someone would unintentionally digest it. Intentionally is a whole nother thing,
Right.
because drug-induced hallucinations might be something that could help explain werewolves throughout history. So I think ergot poisoning is a scientific thing that we want to point to explain, honestly, the cruelty that humans performed against one another. But I think that
Mhm.
that's a very small part of the puzzle. I think that there's definitely other supernatural, religious, and potentially natural explanations behind werewolves.
What's your most favorite explanation of werewolves?
Ooh, that's a really good question.
Because
Um,
there's a lot, right?
there's a lot. There's so many. Like I said, it's the undead and werewolves have been around for so long. It's so hard to like condense it down into one. I think for me, it's less about the explanation in general. My research of monsters looks not at can we explain away this thing, but why did we feel the need to invent these stories? So I
Mhm.
do think that some werewolves, again, wolves are known for things like cannibalism. They do cannibalize in the wild. They are hunters. They hunt together and separately at times. So I think that some werewolf, not all of them, some werewolf accusations probably were early mass murderers, and people who did perform horrific acts, human against human. And because the idea of that sort of trauma and that violence seemed so unusual and so taboo, that we wanted to label it as supernatural so that we felt like we weren't responsible for it in some way.
Yeah, that's I love that explanation for sure. And just going through all of that stuff, I didn't realize that there were werewolf trials as there were
Yeah.
witch trials. I had no idea until I watched your episode. So thank you for that. And before we get out of here, there is something called the Mothman. We touched on
Yes,
it briefly. I kind of flipped, but that's how my brain works sometimes.
that's fine.
But and then there was a movie made that Richard Gere starred in years ago called The Mothman Prophecies.
Mhm.
People can look it up, but it's very much in our lore here in America for sure, just because I believe that one was on the East Coast, those
Yes.
Mothman prophecies, but that has been seen. Just give me a rundown of what that is and to better for people to understand.
So Mothman is a winged humanoid creature with red glowing eyes. He is said to always be male for first thing. Usually
Okay.
he can sort of lift straight up off the ground like a helicopter, often gray in color. But those sightings began in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in November of 1966. And for 13 months after the first sighting, there were hundreds of reported Mothman sightings in the area, which I think is a really interesting social and cultural phenomenon. It's
Yeah.
my opinion
Hmm.
that some of the eyewitnesses did see something. Is that something a supernatural or extraterrestrial, monster? Probably not, to be quite frank. But I
Hmm.
do think that they saw something that was unfamiliar, surprising, in the dark. And Point Pleasant is a really, really small town and a very close knit community. It always has been. So we have to keep in mind that these stories of the Mothman were spreading by word of mouth and a much smaller scale that would be more impactful. So maybe you've either seen the Mothman or someone you intimately know has. And also, Mothman sightings were reported widely in the newspapers. So we have this reinforcement of these sightings and this legend. The sightings did stop in December of 1967 because of a horrific tragedy that did occur in Point Pleasant, the collapse of the Silver Bridge, which did
Hmm.
result in the life of more than 40 individuals. So once that happened, it seems as if the barrier between real danger and this perceived danger was breached too intimately, and Mothman sort of fell to the wayside
Hmm.
until the Mothman prophecy book was released. And I think that that's honestly a lot of the reason that globally even Mothman is known is because of the Mothman prophecies, both the book and then the movie in the early 2000s. I think that if we hadn't had those pop culture texts, we probably wouldn't be talking about Mothman today. But there are Mothman sightings. I know as recently as 2017, Mothman was sighted multiple times in Chicago. So take what you
What?
will. Yes.
They say any certain parts of Chicago, like north
I
side,
can't
south?
I just know that he was always seen by bodies of water at
Okay.
nighttime, usually. And again, as technology advances and this legend becomes more popular, there's a potential that things like pranks, like drones, could be used. I mean, we're advancing a little, so it gets a little harder to sort of believe in these things, but I think we
Sure.
still want to. One of my personal favorite theories for Mothman, I believe it was probably some of the sightings were for barred owls or sandhill cranes. And I do have to point out that in 2017 in Chicago, there was a recording of a much larger sandhill crane population than usual.
Interesting. For sure. Interesting throughout. I mean, I think I could probably talk to you for hours, and I appreciate the time that you've taken. But before I let you out of here, what is your favorite monster? Like, what's the one that intrigues you the most, or is there a group that intrigues you the most?
That's like asking my favorite child. If I had to choose, I would say just the undead across the board. Vampires and zombies were some of the first monsters I was ever introduced to. And so they hold such a special place in my heart. I love them so much. But I really think that my favorite monster speaks to a lot of just the things that I find interesting. So some people like dragons, some people love Mothman. And you know what? Everyone's entitled to that. I believe that we all love scary stories.
Absolutely. Do you have any Halloween traditions that you do
I
in general?
do. So besides the fact that I always watch Halloween on Halloween night,
Absolutely.
100%, that's sort of how I end my evening.
Hmm.
But I also sort of like to do a little homage to my ancestors. I do have some Irish heritage. So one of the traditional aspects of Samhain, that religious holiday, is you leave out little food and drink offerings to appease the spirits. So I do try to leave like a little glass of something and like a little piece of dessert or something out for you. Just cover all your bases, right? If I mean, I'd
I
protect
love that.
myself, and it's a little just homage to my heritage.
Tell everybody where they can see your show on PBS. Just give them the rundown real quick.
You can find Monstrum on PBS's storied YouTube channel and also on pbs.org. We also have a werewolf special running on YouTube right now, so check that out.
All right, Dr. Z, I appreciate the time today. And if for people who want to follow you on Instagram or any of those things, do you have anything you want to share?
Yes, if you'd like to catch up with Monstrum and what I'm doing, you can follow me on Twitter at Zarka Emily, and you can also follow Monstrum on at Monstrum PBS on Instagram.
Awesome. Thank you very much, and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.